This is Aaron Crawford. I'm here for the Center for Presidential History, the Collective Memory Project. And we're talking with Larry Thompson, who was Deputy Attorney General during the first term. Can you give us a little bit about your background and how you ended up first in government service?
Sure. Aaron, I was born and raised in Hannibal, Missouri. I was born in 1945. My father was a railroad laborer. My mother was a cook. Neither one of them graduated from high school. They were very, very good parents. And that was the background in which I was raised. Hannibal is a town of about 18,000 people, 100 miles north of St. Louis on the river. Interestingly, in the Middle West, it's a town at that time with about 5% African American population. So I grew up in that environment. As I said, my parents were not wealthy at all. But I really didn't know, because of the way they raised us, I really didn't know that I had any kind of disadvantages, so to speak. I knew we weren't the wealthiest people in the world. But when I took a sociology class, my sophomore year in college, the textbook described people like me as being disadvantaged. And it took me to go to college and take sociology before I knew I was supposed to be disadvantaged, because I never felt like I could not accomplish anything simply because of the way I was raised.
How did you end up going into the law?
I was, at the time, a junior in my undergraduate school, and I was planning to be a social worker. And one of the real key influencers in my life, a professor by the name of John Sperry at Culver Stockton College. He was a history professor, and he called me up to his desk after class and said, "Mr. Thompson, I understand that you're planning to be a social worker. There's nothing wrong with that, but have you thought about law?" And I had not thought about becoming a lawyer before that conversation with Professor Sperry. When I graduated from Culver in '67, that was at the height of the Vietnam War. I really couldn't go to law school because going to law school, you didn't have a deferment. And what you had to do at that time to get a deferment was to go to graduate school and become a student teacher, and you would get a teaching deferment, and that's what I did. And then I took a job after I received my master's degree from Michigan State University. I took a job at Ford Motor Company and stayed there almost 2 years, and then went to law school at the University of Michigan.
Okay. Explain how you ended up becoming a U.S. attorney in 1982. Sort of the trajectory of your career, because you have had some experience in private enterprise. So how did this happen?
So I'm going to be a little long-winded and answer that question. When I graduated from law school, I decided, after interviewing around in Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, I really decided I wanted to go back to my home state, Missouri, and practice law. I had an offer from the second largest law firm in town at that time, and I also had an offer from Monsanto. And there was a fellow at Monsanto who had graduated from the University of Michigan. I wrote him. He invited me out for an interview, and then Monsanto offered me a job. Well, the Monsanto job paid more than the job in a law firm, and I took that job. It was a very interesting job and much different than a law firm experience. After 1 year at Monsanto, another young man who I had met when we were both taking the Missouri bar exam in 1974 decided to leave the Attorney General's office of Missouri and join Monsanto. And that young man was a lawyer by the name of Clarence Thomas. So early on in my career, I met Clarence Thomas, and in fact, practiced law with him. I decided out at Monsanto that I really didn't want to be a corporate lawyer at that point in my life. Here I have ended up as a corporate lawyer for the last 10 years of my practice. But I decided I was going to go to the law firm that had originally offered me the job in practice in litigation. I was on a case with a law firm from Atlanta by the name of King & Spalding. I told the King & Spalding lawyers that I was going to be leaving, and they said, well, have you thought about joining us? And I also told them that I'd received a call from an executive recruiter, we call them headhunters, from the Coca-Cola company about joining the Coca-Cola company. And the two of those, I think, sort of made them competitive about wanting to get me. And they made me an offer. I still was reluctant. I didn't know anything about Atlanta. And I talked to my friend, then Clarence Thomas, and he told me that I should leave and go to Atlanta. He said St. Louis is a dead city, and Atlanta is where people our age will have an opportunity. And it's really interesting because at the time, St. Louis and Atlanta, the metropolitan areas were about the same, about 2.2 million people. Today, St. Louis is about 2.2 million people, and Atlanta is well over 6 million, maybe 7 million. So it was a very good decision on my part, helped by Clarence Thomas.
So how did you receive the notice from, or the request from the Reagan administration?
Well, out in Missouri, I got interested in Republican Party politics. I helped and volunteered on John Danforth's campaign to be the first Republican elected statewide in Missouri, and he was elected the Attorney General of the state. I go to Atlanta, and people knew I was a Republican, but I was a young associate in the law firm, toiling away as all young associates do. An older partner there by the name of Charles Gowan was bringing a United States Senate candidate around the firm to meet different people. And he stopped in my office, and I called him Mr. Gowan. Mr. Gowan introduced this candidate to me, and his name was Mac Mattingly. He says, Mac, this is Larry Thompson. He's one of the Republicans around here. Larry, I want you to meet Mac. He's from my hometown in Georgia, Brunswick, Georgia. He's a good man. I'm not going to vote for him, but I want you two to meet. Mac was running against Herman Talmadge. A Republican had not been elected statewide in Georgia at that time. This is for the 1980 Senate election. And I really hit it off with Mac. We connected, and I did pro bono volunteer work. In addition to my regular job as an associate, I did policy memos for him, wrote some speeches or had input into some of his speeches, and just sort of helped his campaign. Well, he won. This was when Reagan swept the nation and Mac won. You know, really a surprising turn of events. And here I was, the only person in this firm who was well connected to politics in Georgia. This young lawyer was the only person in the firm who was connected to our new United States Senator in Georgia. And some people encouraged me at that time to take a political job or a public job, but I didn't want to because I thought I was on track to be a partner in the firm. And I became a part of the Judicial Selection Committee. So this was my initial involvement in judicial selection. I was a young lawyer. The committee was run by Earl Phillips, who was a Fisher and Phillips law firm. He was one of the founders of that big labor law firm in Atlanta. And we were involved in selecting federal judges and United States attorneys. Now, with respect to the United States attorney position, I didn't seek it. We picked a person. We selected a person for the job. There were some issues. He withdrew. We selected another person for the job. This person decided that he really didn't want the job after he had said he was going to take it. He withdrew. In the meantime, the Atlanta newspapers were criticizing the Reagan administration for being slow to appoint a new U.S. attorney in Atlanta. There were some articles in the newspaper that basically said that the office was in an uproar because a leader hadn't been appointed. And Earl Phillips, who is the head of this committee, went to my senior partner, Griffin Bell, who was Jimmy Carter's attorney general, and asked Judge Bell for permission to draft me to be the United States attorney. I didn't apply for the job, and I was asked to do it. Rudy Giuliani, who was the Associate Attorney General at the time, was in charge of picking United States attorneys around the country. Atlanta was a fairly large city, significant office then. Rudy preferred to have people in the job who had been federal prosecutors, who had federal prosecutorial experience. I had none. I interviewed with Rudy. He picked me. And several years later, when he was introducing me to some audience, he said proudly, "I selected Larry Thompson to be the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia." But what he ignored was I was his third pick.
So, I mean, how old were you about this point?
I believe I was 36.
36. That's really young.
It's really young.
So, this is really your first experience with the selection of nominees on the federal level. What was your impression? How would you characterize this process at that point in your life?
Well, I didn't see the negative parts of the process during this period of time. It was sort of haphazard. It was a bit informal. But the committee that I served on really was trying to make certain that we picked good lawyers. Obviously, we wanted to pick Republicans, but we wanted to pick good, solid lawyers for these positions. And I didn't see the negative aspects of judicial selection until later on in my career. But that was my first experience with the process.
Well, I guess we'll move to maybe the first time you have this, a different type of experience with the process, and that's the confirmation of Jeff Sessions.
Yes.
Can you explain that issue and how you became involved in
Sure.
his confirmation to a federal judgeship?
Well, Jeff Sessions and I served as United States attorneys at the same time. I served in Atlanta. Jeff was in Mobile. We were in the midst of the so-called war on drugs. This was the first major effort the country had undertaken. And the U.S. attorney in Atlanta was named the chief of the Southeastern Drug Task Force. Now that was an interesting position because each of us in Georgia, Alabama, Florida, North Carolina, and South Carolina were presidentially appointed U.S. attorneys. I was named the chief, and you had to really deal with that responsibility gingerly because you really couldn't consider yourself a first among equals. But we managed to make it work in the Southeast. Jeff was a big supporter of mine. He was a good man. In addition, we became friends because when we traveled to Washington and other places where we had U.S. attorney conferences, Jeff and I would like to go out to a nice restaurant. But the per diem was so small that each U.S. attorney received, we decided that the only way we could go out to a nice restaurant was to room together and have just half of our room bill. So we would always room together, separate beds, but we would room together, and then we had enough money left to go out to dinner. Now, I got to know him through that process. He was I can't overemphasize, he was a big supporter of mine as the head of the Southeastern Drug Task Force. And when he was nominated for a federal judgeship, and then these allegations and charges that he was racist, that he was somehow unfair, I knew to be completely untrue. And I was shocked by the charges. And that was my introduction to the judicial selection process that was very partisan, very unfair, very bare knuckles, and people wanted to win, and there were very little rules. And a lot of what was involved was what I would call character assassination, to stop people. And people would do anything to try to stop someone who they wanted to stop. It had nothing to do with that person's qualifications. Jeff Sessions was an excellent United States attorney. He is an excellent lawyer. There was absolutely no reason under the sun for him not to be a federal judge, except there were partisan politics at play in Alabama, and he was defeated. I have an interesting memory from that session, from that time period in my life. I went in and talked to Senator Heflin and talked to him about Jeff. He wanted to talk to me. And in the room was Senator East from North Carolina. He didn't say much, but both of these men were in the room. And I explained to Senator Heflin my relationship with Jeff, how I got to know him, my impression of him. And Senator Heflin said, "You know, you've done a great job in standing up for Jeff, your friend, and I admire that." And then he said, "I'm going to vote for Jeff." He didn't vote for Jeff. So that was a real introduction to me of Washington politics.
So, I mean, you at some level you felt compelled to step into this dispute over whether Sessions was, racist or had acted in that way. I guess we can understand what compelled you to do it, but what were some of the reactions, both professionally and maybe personally, that you from getting involved in this process?
Well, the reason I felt compelled to step in is the way I was raised. Jeff was a friend. I didn't volunteer to do this. He asked me to support him. And, I was raised to be loyal and support your friends. There was a reaction. Some of the politicians in Atlanta attacked me. I had a very unpleasant conversation with Mayor Maynard Jackson about my support of Jeff. And I told him straight up why I had done it. And not only why I had done it, but my impression of Jeff. Mayor Jackson kind of was impressed by that and said, "I respect you for this." And I didn't say I'm supporting him because the White House asked me to do it. That's what he thought, or that we're both Republicans. I said, he's a friend, and I know him, and here's how I know him. And Maynard and I became, very good acquaintances the rest of that time in Atlanta.
Well, let's jump to the next experience of the contentious process of nominations, and that is the Thomas nomination.
Mm-hmm.
How did you become involved in Clarence Thomas's nomination to the Supreme Court, and what was your responsibilities or duties or whatever?
One of the worst episodes of my career, and it was a very unfortunate episode. And I was very discouraged at the end, even though we had quote won in the quote. So again, Clarence was and is a dear and close friend of mine. We had watched him go through the first process and thought everything was going to be fine. And then we saw all of the allegations coming up. I again thought he was going to make it. He called me one evening and said, "This is tough. I really would like for you to come up here because I really don't trust anyone. I don't know who is my friend and who's my enemy. I had a case in Los Angeles that was involving a federal prosecutor, and we had a matter that was going before a federal magistrate judge. Interestingly, both of whom were female. And Clarence said, "Can you come up?" And I said, I think he called me on a Monday or Tuesday. I said, "I've got to go to LA. I'll come up next week." He said, "It'll be all over then." So, and he said, "Thank you, but it'll be all over then." So I called the prosecutor and asked her for a continuance. You know, I get this chilly reception. You know, almost unheard of to do that. She said, "What's the reason for a continuance?" I explained to her the situation with Judge Thomas. She says, "Well, no one would make that up." We called the magistrate judge, and she said the same thing. And we had the continuance. And I flew to Washington. I didn't know what was going on. We went to Senator Danforth's office, and that was my first time. I met with Mike Ludick, who had been confirmed. He just had not been sworn in as a judge. He was Clarence's handler. Of course, Mike was still a government official. He was limited in the ways that he could shepherd this nomination through the Senate, and made a quick assessment of what was going on, saw my friend in pain. I didn't have a formal charter to do anything but, you know, look at the legal aspects. You know, at this point in time, I'm a trial lawyer. I had a practice that involved internal investigations and representing clients in trouble. I'd kind of seen a crisis situation, obviously nothing like this. This was the first time I'd ever done anything in Washington in a public way. But I knew that this was more than just the advise and consent process. In fact, someone said to me when I said, we need to go out and prep some of these witnesses before they appear before the Senate. "Oh, Larry, you shouldn't do that. This is the advise and consent process." And I said, "This is not the advise and consent process. This looks like a trial to me, and I'm going to treat it like a trial." I needed some help. We called on Dick Leon, who remains a dear friend, who went to Holy Cross with Clarence. He was practicing law there. We needed some more help. A young lawyer at WilmerHale by the name of Barbara, and I cannot think of her last name. She subsequently married Ted Olson, Barbara Olson. I was a little leery of Barbara. I didn't know her, and I always perceived of WilmerHale being, a Democratic firm, so I was a little leery of having her on the team initially, but she was terrific, and she was a fighter. And the three of us just handled the legal-related issues that were associated with that nomination. I've written a review of the Showtime movie about this and some of the things we did with respect to the not the wiretap, but the lie detector test, polygraph, some public, some press releases we caused to be issued. That whole episode is something that, again, was a bare knuckles fight with no referee. So if you can think of our system, our adversary system, without a judge and no one to keep the parties in check, and each side was determined to prevail. We were determined to prevail because this was our friend, and we felt that really bad things were happening to him. underhanded things, unfair things, untruths propagated on him. Now, so we had to react in a very tough way. There were maybe some things that I did that I'm not necessarily proud of, and certainly wouldn't have done if we were in a normal litigation setting. But this was tough, and my friend had to undergo an unbelievably painful process of all kinds of unfairness, untruths, from powerful forces. And it was the worst. And it was the worst professional experience I've had in 41 years of practicing law. Nothing has even come close.
So, I mean, you're at a really unique point here. I mean, you're not, like you said, you're independent of the government here. What was your assessment, let's say, the Bush administration's ability to handle this? Or what was their role? I mean, this seemed, we'd been through the Bork nomination by this point, but this seemed to have caught them by real surprise.
Boyd and Gray was terrific, but he was limited as to what he could do. He offered us a lot of help, but the help he could offer us, he was limited in what he could do. He was a public official. Lee, I cannot think of her last name, was one of his assistants, and there were two people that worked under Boyden who we really worked with a lot. I'm having a senior moment. I cannot remember their names, but they were terrific people. There were others who wanted to throw Clarence under the bus in the Bush administration. And when, for example, we issued a press release stating that we believe, based upon a psychologist that I had talked to, that Ms. Hill had delusional tendencies. A person who I'm not going to mention called me and said, "You can't do that. I forbid you from doing that." And I said to him, "I don't work for you. I'm representing Judge Thomas." And we did it.
What was your feelings on the idea of advise and consent on the other spectrum of it?
It was a joke. This was not advise and consent. This was a trial without a judge. Judge Thomas called it a lynch mob, but a high-tech lynching, but it certainly was something that there was no referee. No one was attempting to be professional or fair or truthful. And it was an awful situation. Someone has said, "Would you like to be on the Supreme Court?" Well, maybe. But I certainly wouldn't be on the Supreme Court if I had to go through what Clarence Thomas went through. It's not worth it.
Well, in light of this experience, you eventually do end up going through a confirmation process. Maybe you could explain a little bit how, what you were doing in the intervening years until President George W. Bush was elected. But what were your feelings going into this?
I was practicing law.
What were your feelings going into this process? You're asked to be Deputy Attorney General. You know you're going to be in this process. It was no secret the last year of the Clinton administration that the idea of judicial nominations had been pretty tough. Some standoffs. What was your feelings when you were going into this process?
Obviously I thought about what had happened to Justice Thomas. I didn't, maybe naively, I didn't expect any issues on my part because my practice had not grown. It had grown, but it had become a varied practice. I did a lot of white-collar criminal defense work. I had an interesting practice. I represented companies. I represented individuals who were in trouble. I represented a lot of Democrats. I represented a lot of Democratic politicians. I helped them. If you look at the people who wrote letters on my behalf, the head of the Georgia Democratic Party wrote a letter on my behalf. So Reverend Joseph Lowry supported me. So it's not because, and they knew who I was, but it was different.
And on that level, you had a few problems, but you get caught up in the fight over nominations anyway.
Yes.
Explain exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And
so I can't remember. You had in your notes to me that my confirmation had been delayed, and I cannot remember why it was delayed.
all the literature points to President Bush's judicial nominations.
Mm-hmm.
There are probably 10 that were controversial, and the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee were going to hold up both your nomination and Ted Olson's until these nominations were pulled. It was the first standoff.
I see.
Over these.
That was the reason.
And apparently, this is very early in the administration. This is
Mm-hmm.
starts to happen in late April. You were nominated in February, so you were going through the process. When did you get a sense that you were being caught up in something larger here?
Well, yeah, you have refreshed my recollection. That was mild compared to what I'd seen before, and I didn't worry about it. I just kind of said, okay, it'll get sorted out. I do know there was a bit of controversy because Ted and I were put together under the theory that I was less controversial than he, and therefore it would take some of the sting away from the focus on him. So, I don't know. But we did go through it together.
You're confirmed in early May. And this is when President Bush announces his first slate of judicial nominations. Now, I guess explain to us a little bit about your duties as Deputy Attorney General and the relation to to the issue of nominations.
Let me say a little bit about before that, what happened with the Justice Thomas process. Again, this was the first time I'd done anything of a political nature in Washington. I'd had clients who had cases, and we had to go to the Air Force or the Army in terms of some contract compliance issues and things like that. But I had never had to do anything in Congress or in a congressional investigation or hearing. I got to meet Senator Biden during that time, Senator from Pennsylvania. He died recently. Specter. I got to meet Senator Kennedy. And I want to segue into my own confirmation because Senator Kennedy remembered me. And I told him that my mother had a photo or a poster of his brother on her wall, and she admired his brother. And he called my mother in Missouri. She's not a constituent. And he called my mother in Missouri and told her that she was in an independent living facility and told her that he was going to vote for me. And that's something she still remembers, she remembers to this day. So I had a chance to meet people. We were tough, but we didn't, if we said we weren't going to do something, we didn't do it. And, I don't know whether or not that buys you any currency, but it does buy, people know you. So I went through that process and was voted on. I think the only vote, I got an abstention from Senator Cole, who didn't like my involvement in the Thomas matter.
When you're once you're confirmed and you're in the administration, you're on the other side of
Had
this
nothing
issue.
to do with me being Deputy Attorney General, but
Yeah, and this is, when you're on the other side, you start to see something, I guess, the different perspective. And were you surprised by anything that you saw, actually having to work on that side of helping select nominations or help get people confirmed?
Well, my role in the judicial selection process was limited as it related to federal judges because of the events that subsumed us shortly after I became
Right.
Deputy Attorney General. We did have I played a very active role in U.S. Attorney selection. I'd been a U.S. Attorney. John had been had not done anything like that before, and he and I worked very close and hand in hand in selecting U.S. attorneys. Every single U.S. attorney that we selected, they were interviewed by John and myself. That had never happened when I was U.S. attorney. I didn't get a chance to meet Attorney General Smith until there was some matter in the Northern District of Georgia, and he visited. I was close to General Meese, but I didn't get a chance to meet them as I was being selected. But I thought it was very important that each of the 94 U.S. attorneys understand that we are part of a team, and that we need to be, we have sort of an independent obligation as federal prosecutors, but we have to be a part of the team in the Bush administration. And I think we were very successful. And I think that one of the U.S. attorneys, that we had some controversy in the selection process, and John and I signed off on selecting this person. Chris Christie has turned out to be a real shining star, and he did a great job, by the way, as U.S. attorney. All the U.S. attorneys report up through the deputy in the Department of Justice bureaucracy, so I had a chance to work with all of them, and to a person, they were all terrific lawyers. And most of them were pretty good people to work with. Well, most of them,
Well, I guess maybe I'm curious about that process and the criteria you have in selecting those. I mean, we've talked to plenty of people about, these judicial nominations, but we do, the U.S. attorneys always come up. It's sort of this cousin, particularly in light of events in the second term. So, it's always a question that comes back to what are your criteria for what makes a good judge or a good U.S. attorney?
That's a good question. May I answer the judge thing? Because my input on the district judge selection was the following. Having been a trial lawyer, and a judge can affect a matter in dispute in a case in so many different ways. And in fact, a great majority of the decisions that a district judge makes in a case, they're unreviewable. And they have nothing to do with policy. They have nothing to do with politics. So if you get an irascible judge, a judge who has the improper judicial temperament, it makes no difference whether she or he is a liberal or a conservative, because they're ruling on all these matters of fact and evidence. They have nothing to do with anything, and those kinds of people are not good judges. So one of the things I try to impart on my colleagues at the justices, make certain we're picking people who are good lawyers and who are going to be impartial at the district court level, because at that level you're not getting into policy that much, in theory, in ideology. And if you do make a mistake, you have the Court of Appeals to smack them down. So I think by and large we picked judges who knew how to try cases, that we had a lot of confidence that they would be good trial judges, and would be impartial in the sense of the conduct of a trial, when you're not dealing with issues of evidence or ideology. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. Well,
it's interesting that you bring this issue up.
That's different, by the way. Excuse me. that's different than what I would look for in a Court of Appeals judge.
Well, this is why senatorial courtesy had always given senators a lot of say in district
Yeah.
court judges, but this seems to change.
It does.
And I think my impression is that many people were surprised in the administration that these become so politicized.
That's right.
Explain exactly maybe why that was going on, and the reaction to it.
Sure. I think some of that started, I was shocked that Jeff Sessions had such a bitter fight as a district court judge. And then it continued on with Bork, and then it continued on with Justice Thomas. And, the whole process, I think, had gotten out of control. And it's unfair because you have men and women who have to put their careers on hold. They accept the call to public service. They're not making any money after they accept that. People aren't coming to judges, lawyers who are going to become judges because they don't know if they can continue to handle their case.
Well, particular senators, of course, complained that the administration had no plans to really do any consultation with them, and in essence, it destroys the blue slip system within
Right.
a few short years. This happens at a particular point in time. The events of the election of 2000,
Yeah.
and you have 9/11. You have all of these contentious things. It seems like this is a very odd type of partisanship
Mm-hmm.
that emerges. And did it change the way district judges were selected?
I think given it had to be in a particular location, and I do think that's a very perceptive question, because I do think if you really wanted to get a person in and the caseload in the district was such that you needed to have a judge or two added, you tend to have a bias toward picking someone who is safe as opposed to someone who would be a perfect district court judge, but because he or she in their extracurricular activity did something like a young Larry Thompson did early on in his career, and that is work for a candidate for the United States Senate and write speeches for him and do policy papers for him.
Well, compare the appellate process.
And I had views. I was could I have been a district court judge at some point in my career? If you Google me, at some point I was on the board of the Southeastern Legal Foundation. We did a lot of work as it related to affirmative action issues. I can tell you that a lot of the affirmative action plans that we attacked in the Southeast were affirmative action plans for friends of the mayors. They weren't affirmative action plans designed as you might think an affirmative action plan would be designed. And the mayor of Atlanta, Bill Campbell, went after me, said he was going to picket my house, attacked me in the paper. I had to resign from a case because a major client thought I was too much of a liability to have on the case. And if somehow a district judge position had been open and I had wanted it, I probably would have a tough time during that period.
In light of that, you during your tenure, you see some of these appellate nominations are the most contentious probably
Yes.
in American history, and maybe contrast that experience of the district court nominees versus the appellate court, and kind of what is at stake. And I'm thinking particularly of the Estrada nomination.
Or Jim Haynes.
There are several of these that are just really, really poisonous.
Yes,
And
that's the right word for them.
and particularly the Estrada nomination. That one seems to be almost in a class by itself. Explain sort of, did the administration anticipate this kind of reaction, and how would you explain it?
I don't know, because I wasn't involved in that process, and I explain it by it being a continuation of some of the things that we talked about with respect to Sessions and Thomas. But I also would think with Estrada especially, the administration, not backing down admirably. Now, could you have done something in terms of a political process in getting him through? I don't know. I don't have enough information to talk about that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your time as Deputy Attorney General. We talked some the relations and nominations. What exactly were your duties? And we know that they changed suddenly on 9/11. That priorities shifted. But explain exactly what the Deputy Attorney General is.
The Deputy Attorney General is basically the Chief Operating Officer for the Department of Justice, which at the time had about 125,000, 130,000 people. You have the United States Attorney's offices, the litigating divisions in Main Justice, the Bureau of Prisons, DEA, the FBI. All of these were a part of the Department of Justice, and the deputy is the Chief Operating Officer. During our time, my duties dramatically changed because I was confirmed in May of 2001, and we were hit in September. And the events that followed were just all-consuming. There wasn't any playbook to go to look and see what do you do when over 3,000 of your fellow countrymen are murdered. And so we had to, and I'm really glad that I had the experience that I did. I think that experience was very valuable because we really had to change the way we looked at law enforcement, certainly as it related to potential terrorist activities. And we had to change from where we were prior to 9/11, which was investigation and prosecution. You had the bombing in the World Trade Center in the 90s, and the FBI investigated, and we prosecuted. Well, you can't afford to do that when you face the prospect of mass murders. And so we changed from investigation and prosecution to prevention and disruption. And that was tough. Agencies don't like to share information with each other. U.S. attorneys do not like to share information with each other. And we really had to bang heads. And I had a great partner in Bob Mueller. But some of the U.S. attorneys still wanted to have their big cases. And I think, by and large, we were very successful. And the Deputy Attorney General normally doesn't have a lot of, or maybe even the Attorney General, but normally does not have a lot of day-to-day contact with the President of the United States. But because of the nature of the threat, I met frequently, certainly every week, with President Bush when he was being briefed. I would get the briefings in the morning from the FBI in the FBI PSYOC room. Then we would go to the White House, brief the President, then we'd come back, and then I was in charge of all the national security efforts that the Department of Justice did, and I would have a meeting of my staff. I was very impressed with President Bush during this period of time, especially the events right after 9/11, because he made some tough decisions that I think went a long way toward preventing the reoccurrence of some attack by Al-Qaeda, because they'd gone a long way in training people and in having plans to do more things like they did with the World Trade Center towers. So it was an all-consuming period of my life. I never got home, never ever got home before 9:30, and I was picked up every morning at 6:30 to go to the FBI.
Well, I want to ask you in detail more about particularly the different type of agencies, because in some of the other projects we run into this issue, particularly when it comes to presidential decision making, which is the government, in essence, filled with silos, with people who don't speak with one another, don't communicate, and it seems at some level almost impossible to make a decision when you can't have the flow of really good information. So how did you deal with this inside of the Justice Department? Because you bring up all of the things you're in charge of, and I can see every one of those being very, very important in this, the new war on terror at this point. So what are some of the details about what you did?
You're asking me about a very poignant part of my tenure because, I saw these silos early on, and I was involved in the briefings starting in July where we picked up all kinds of chatter about some kind of terrorist activity against Americans. None of us thought that it would happen on the homeland, but we knew that, as George Tenet said, that the system was blinking red. We knew the chatter was at an all-time high. Mike Chertoff and I talked a lot about the wall that was within the Department of Justice, where FBI agents working on intelligence matters were not allowed to talk about those matters to criminal prosecutors because of the belief that the prosecutors would circumvent the normal procedures like warrants and things like this and subpoenas and make a criminal case, outside of the Fourth Amendment. And that was a wall, and it wasn't working. And so in August of 2001, I issued a memo which lowered the wall a little bit and which commanded FBI agents to bring any kind of evidence of a federal felony, any kind of evidence, to the criminal prosecutors. Some people didn't like that memo. The FISA court chief judge called me and questioned me about that memo. And there were good reasons for having this wall, by the way, and we inherited that. When I say we, the Bush administration, these procedures had been set in place by the Clinton administration because of concerns about misuse in the criminal context of intelligence information. I think the concerns were legitimate. But, I have certainly at the time, I had just a feeling, should I have been more aggressive? That soon connected all the dots that should have been connected, because we could have prevented this. What happened was entirely preventable if we hadn't had these silos. And my memo went out in August, and we get hit 2 weeks later.
It makes me wonder. I mean, after this point, you are in the room with the president fairly regularly. I mean, what's your thoughts about the information that gets to a president when they make those decisions? Because, as we look back now, it's become history. A lot of criticisms, but what did you think at the time about what is the quality of the information that gets to a president?
Yeah. Well, the information that gets to the president prior to 9/11, I think, was of low quality because you had all these silos. And so the CIA prepared the briefing. And so if the information came from the CIA, it probably was pretty good information. But if the FBI had some information, or if a military intelligence agency had some information, they weren't going to tell the CIA. And the president would never hear about it. Now, that changed dramatically after 9/11. And our response. I remember after 9/11, President Bush authorizing a mission, a joint mission between the Department of Justice and the Pentagon, and deputized myself as Deputy Attorney General and Paul Wolfowitz as Deputy Defense Secretary to work on this mission. That would have been unheard of prior to 9/11. The Justice Department working with the military.
So, I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but I want to talk about, there's the shift that you have into problems with corporate crime.
Oh, yes.
This is another major story and a major shift in your career. How did that happen? I mean, it seems very actually logical with your background that you would understand white collar crime, things like that. That issue and then the entire experience. I'm very curious about your resignation, why you decided to retire.
Oh, hell, I can get to that. That's really easy. We had two major events in the Bush administration, Department of Justice, where the department had never had to deal with national security matters in terms of protecting the homeland, and then, of course, the corporate scandals of 2002. By the way, I was the de facto Secretary of Homeland Security. I led something called the Prevention Task Force, which morphed into the Department of Homeland Security. And I was the happiest person in the country to see Tom Ridge get confirmed, and we could turn all that stuff over to him. But, the corporate scandals were amazing. And, what happened with Enron with a $30 billion market cap or $40 billion. And just in 1 second, it evaporated. We never had anything like that happen. That amount of money and people, investors losing that amount, and real people. And President Bush was very strong. He authorized a formation of a corporate fraud task force. Of course, a lot of people didn't think that Republicans were going to do anything in this area. He gave us resources, and we undertook a very serious investigation of these matters. I'm really proud of what we did. I mean, we actually put people in jail. A number of CEOs, CFOs, general counsel went to jail during this period of time in the Bush administration. It was not without some controversy within the administration. You've heard of my memo.
The Thompson, that's the next question, is the Thompson memo.
And it was not without some controversy. Some people thought, not that we shouldn't investigate and prosecute wrongdoers, but that should we have this concentrated task force approach? Are we demonizing business people? So there were some concerns about what we were doing. We felt that this was a crime problem in a sense, almost like a crime wave. That's just what I felt. It was something similar to the drug explosion of the 80s that I dealt with as a young prosecutor in Atlanta. And we had to be aggressive in getting at this. I knew from experience that white collar cases are complex, and you just couldn't let them drag on for 5 and 6 years like they had been. I was called to the East Room, and I got a call from Alberto Gonzalez saying, you and Bob Mueller need to get over here. The president wants to talk to you. Some people were unhappy with what you guys are doing. Too many headlines that are negative against businesses. So what we did was make a decision not to talk about strategy or whether you should have a task force approach or have individual prosecutions. What we did was decide we're going to give the president some examples of the things that we were then investigating, like executives making up numbers, like executives lying to their outside auditors, things like that. And we gave the president 3 or 4 examples of what we were doing. These are the investigations. And, they're being handled in the task force approach where someone in Arizona can learn from what someone in New Jersey is doing. And the president turned to one of his advisors after we got through and said, we can't let people get away with that stuff. And then he said, LT, he called me LT, LT and Bobby, keep up the good work. This goes against anything people ever thought about President Bush being soft on white collar crime or business.
Well, I mean, the critics of the memo, they portrayed both the administration and the memo as this is the effort to minimize the penalties of offenders. But you're talking about your the personal experience here. I mean, what is give me, I guess, some of your feelings about once again being in the media over the memo and
Well, what we did in the memo, and we should have never used the phrase attorney-client privilege, because certainly as a lawyer, I respect that privilege and think it's important. If I was ever a target of a criminal investigation, I want my communications with my attorney kept confidential. However, what we were doing when we were trying to make an assessment as to what fine, for example, or how to dispose of a case against an organization, a company, we would say, we think Mary has some problems here, or had problems here. What do you know about her? Why have you moved her? Why haven't you fired her? We just wanted to know what happened before we sign off on something. And every time we were getting, oh, we can't talk to you about that. It's privileged. And you just have to trust us that we're doing the right thing. Now, we had limited resources. A lot of the agents had gone off to do terrorism work. And so the FBI resources to deal with these kinds of things was probably cut in half. And certainly it's not a sustainable proposition to just trust somebody. And so what we said was, you're going to have to cooperate nevertheless if you want to get credit for cooperation, because there are substantial credits corporations can get. And even if you have to waive the attorney-client privilege, lots of companies waive the attorney-client privilege. I can tell you, having been a general counsel of a public company and representing public companies before that if I went before the board of your company and said, we can get this terrible matter resolved with the government. We're in the headlines every day. We can get this terrible matter resolved, but the only thing is the government wants us to waive the attorney-client privilege, and I'm not going to do it. I guarantee you that board would say, well, you're out of here. We're going to get a general counsel who can get this matter resolved. This is totally a creation of the legal profession, acting like a guild and not taking higher purpose for some of these things. I've said that. It's my profession. I'm proud of it, but they're acting like a guild. We are acting like a guild when we criticize these kinds of things. And I'm very proud of what we did. Now, this administration just recently came out with a new memo that's much worse than the old Thompson memo, which they said to corporations, and even I have problems with this one, if you want credit, you're going to have to finger the bad guys in your company. You're going to have to tell us who the guilty guys are. Now, think about that one. If you're representing a corporation and you're interviewing an executive, you've got to be ethical about it. And before he talks to you, don't you think you need to warn him that if you open your mouth to me, I may have to go in and finger you and send you to jail? You'd better get a lawyer before you talk to me? Anyway. But look, my son, I have been really professionally treated, I think, very unfairly because of that memo. I get, even to this day, I'm the object of ridicule in the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal because they still use that memo, which came out in 2002 or 3, and they call it the odious Thompson memo and its progeny. But my sons said something that I think is very wise. They said, "Forget about it, Dad. It's just going to be in your obituary." So what I'm trying to do is have other things in my obituary that will counterbalance that.
Well, in interest, I guess, of starting to conclude, why did you resign in August of 2003? Yeah. I mean, there's a rash of these resignations, but I think Mike Isikoff said yours was surprising. It was sort of a surprise to see you go.
Mike was a good guy. I was tired, and Judge Bell had I was 55 when I went in to the administration, and Judge Bell, who was my mentor, said you should treat Washington as if you're going to Las Vegas. Set aside a pile of money, and when you lose it, come home. I had a setback because King and Spalding had a retirement plan that wasn't vested, wasn't funded. And I thought I would be able to draw from that plan for 10 years after I retired. The government ethics office said because it wasn't funded, then it was an interest in a private business, so I had to withdraw it over a 24-month period, which really cut the value of that. That's one thing. And I just run out of money, and I was spending $3,000 to $5,000 a month more than I was making. And the combination of being exhausted and my acorns dwindling, I just decided it was the right thing to do for my family.
Well, I guess that sort of answers part of the next question. So, you were not long after you leave, you're starting to be talked about as the next. If there's a vacancy soon, you're going to be the next nominee. Did you have any sense of that you were seriously considered, or I mean, this is a whole other experience? Now you're being talked about going through the process that you've seen up close, and it's not very pleasant. Kind of explain that from the time you left from 2003 to the two nominations.
I don't know if I was seriously considered. I do know that Andy Card called me and asked me if I was nominated, would I accept it? And I was in an interesting situation. If you know corporations, I had only been at PepsiCo 2-3 years, and the trigger in my employment arrangement was I had to stay 5 years to get all these options and goodies and all this stuff. So that was an interesting thing. I don't know if my name was leaked just to throw off the reporters and get the person that they were truly interested in. But something really memorable happened during that time I'd like to share with you. Senator Kennedy called me. Maybe I shouldn't share it, but since this is the Bush administration, Senator Kennedy saying something good about, seriously. Senator Kennedy called me and said, in his New England, sort of accent brogue, a bunch of us have been talking, and we think you would make a good Supreme Court justice. I translated it to mean you're the best of a bad lot. And then he said something that was really interesting. He says, Larry, do you want me to praise you or condemn you? And I said, Senator, if you think I should be on the Supreme Court, you'd better condemn me. And, that happened. And now there was an article in Jan Greenberg's book about some people, and there's a page in her book about this process and about me. And it's ironic that I'm at the Federalist Society meeting, but there were some Federalist Society people. You're shaking your head. There's some Federalist Society people who said, he's not somebody we really want. We don't know what he stands for on certain issues because I'd not spoken out on abortion. Probably took a more law enforcement view of the Second Amendment than some people in the administration would have liked, because my background is in law enforcement. And so this group of people, and I don't know what kind of influence they had on the White House, but this group of people thought that I might turn out to be another Kennedy, according to Jan Greenberg. So for whatever reason, I never got the call. I would have accepted it.
Well, I have to go back. You said Andy Card asked you if you would accept. What did you tell him?
Yes.
Told him yes.
Oh, you can't.
Yeah. You didn't clear, right?
Yeah.
I was like, okay. So, I guess in the interest of kind of wrapping things up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
No.
it's been great. Maybe kind of give your take on the Bush administration's legacy as far as the judiciary and maybe even to some extent law enforcement. What should we remember? And what were the successes of the administration? What were the failures?
Because I wasn't as involved in the judicial selection process, because of the things that we just talked about, I will just say, based upon my observation, I think we appointed really good judges, solid judges, who will follow the law and who are good lawyers. As it relates to law enforcement, I think the administration had an enormous impact on law enforcement because of the two signal events that related to law enforcement, and the whole notion of turning our domestic law enforcement as it related to anti-terrorism into protection versus just investigation and prosecution, protecting us from mass murders and things like that. I think that was huge. I think certain provisions of the Patriot Act, which allow for information sharing and allow us to use intelligence in protecting ourselves in the homeland, I think they were key. They were subject to being sunsetted. They were reauthorized. I think those provisions are very, very strong. As it relates to white collar crime, I think now these crimes that we experience, the corporate governance kind of crimes versus the financial crimes that we experienced in 2008 and 9. But the fact of the matter is we did hold these crooked executives in these companies accountable for the financial harm that they wrought on a lot of shareholders and employees. We did hold individuals responsible, and we prosecuted corporations. The Anderson case was one in which Anderson turned down a potential settlement, very much like what KPMG accepted, and KPMG today is a viable organization. They were rolling the dice as it related to the government, and there was clear criminal conduct involved in that case. The Supreme Court didn't overturn the case on the merits. It's overturned the case based on a jury instruction, which the Department of Justice had nothing to do with. So I'm proud of our accomplishments and our legacy, especially as it relates to white collar crime. And I hope, obviously it's not going to happen in this administration, the Obama administration, but I hope the next administration will focus on individuals in some of these financial crimes and white collar crimes, as well as going after the company, because of the collateral consequences of being indicted, the company really has very little choice but to accept the plea, pay a big fine, and move on. Even if you think the government is wrong, because it's too risky.
Well, Larry Thompson, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.